All right, part 3 of chapter 20, the appointed time for the redemption of Zion, September 11th of 1836. Events related to the removal of the stronghold or priesthood hedge in Kirtland. When we consider the amazing implication in Joseph Smith's declaration that something new must be done for the salvation of the church, we need to have historical context. One of the truly remarkable prophecies in the D&C is the 5-year prophecy in section 64, given on September 11th of 1831, wherein the Lord said that the Kirtland would be a stronghold for just 5 more years. Joseph interpreted the 5-year period to literally end on September 11th of 1836. Quote, I, the Lord, will to retain a stronghold in the land of Kirtland for the space of 5 years, in which I will not overthrow the wicked, that thereby I may save some. And after that day I, the Lord, will not hold any guilty that shall go with an open heart up to the land of Zion. For I, the Lord, require the hearts of the children of men. Behold, now it's called today until the coming of the Son of Man. And verily it is a day of sacrifice, and a day of the tithing of my people. For he that is tithed shall not be burned at his coming. For after today cometh the burning. This is speaking after the manner of the Lord. For verily I say, tomorrow all the proud and they that do wickedly shall be as stubble, and I will burn them up. For I am the Lord of hosts, and I will not spare any that remain in Babylon. Wherefore, if ye believe me, ye will labor while it is called today. And that's D&C 64. Joseph Smith took that prophetic 5-year time sequence very seriously and literally, to the day. About 3 years after the prophetic declaration by the Lord on August 16th of 1834, Joseph Smith sent a letter to the brethren in Zion, i.e. Lyman White, Edward Partridge, John Correll, Isaac Morley, and others, stating that September 11th, 1836 was the appointed time for the redemption of Zion. Quote, and I would brackets recommend end of bracket to Brother White to use every effort to prevail on the churches to gather to those regions and situate themselves to be in readiness to move into Jackson County in 2 years from the 11th of September next, which is the appointed time for the redemption of Zion. End of quote. I'm going to suggest that the September 11th, 1836 deadline, after which Kirtland would no longer to be a stronghold, interrelates quite closely with God's admonition to the saints in section 88. Verse 62, to, quote, call upon me while I am near, end of quote, which echoes the admonition of the Lord in Isaiah 55:6, to, quote, seek ye the Lord while he may be found. Call ye upon him while he is near, end of quote. Clearly, the Lord was not always going to be near. The Lord was only going to be speaking to the saints for a short period of time because he knew that the saints would reject the fullness of the gospel, following which the heavens would begin to close. A close look at the 15-year public ministry demonstrates that about 110 canonized revelations were received through Joseph Smith during the first 5 years of his ministry, prior to the September 11th of 1836 deadline. After that date, when the stronghold was removed, only about 15 canonized revelations were received through Joseph Smith during the next decade leading up to the martyrdom. The heavens noticeably began to close after the stronghold was removed. So what exactly is a stronghold? The Greek word for stronghold, when taken literally, means fortress or place of protection. That is how the term is often used in the Old Testament. It's often associated with the term tower and hedge. Interestingly, the Lord would eventually explain how Zion would be redeemed by providing the parable of the redemption of Zion that would speak of the building of a tower and protecting it with a hedge. I'm going to suggest that the term stronghold in the context it is used in section 64 refers to a hedge of spiritual and physical protection, and that Isaiah chapter 5 is a literal prophecy about the restored church during the Kirtland era. Isaiah 5 is a lamentation about the Lord's vineyard and how he planted his choicest vine in the vineyard and built a tower and expected it to bring forth grapes. It brought forth wild grapes. Quote, now will I sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved touching his vineyard. My well-beloved hath a vineyard in a very fruitful hill, and he fenced it, and gathered out the stones thereof, and planted it with the choicest vine, and built a tower in the midst of it, and also made a winepress therein. And he looked that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. End of quote. In his anger and disappointment, the Lord removes the hedge of protection from the vineyard after the wild grapes are produced. Quote, and now go to, I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away the hedge thereof, and it shall be eaten up, and break down the wall thereof, and it shall be trodden down, and I will lay it waste. It shall not be pruned, nor digged, but there shall come up briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of the hosts is the house of Israel. End of quote. The taking away of the hedge enables the vineyard to be trodden down and laid waste. Briars and thorns replaced the vine. Commanding the clouds to not give rain apparently symbolizes the heavens closing and revelation ceasing. The result is apostasy and the scattering of the house of Israel. This perfectly describes what happened to the restored church in the Kirtland era, as will be documented in this chapter. Joseph Smith had a prophetic dream while in the Carthage jail, just prior to his martyrdom, wherein he described visiting his old farm in Kirtland. He personally did not own a farm in Kirtland, but the farm in the prophetic dream apparently referred to the church, and the barn symbolized the temple. He acknowledged that the farm had been neglected and was full of weeds and brambles. The barn was missing the floor and doors. The farm of the barn had a curse placed upon it. Quote, I was back in Kirtland, Ohio, and thought I would take a walk out by myself and view my old farm, which I found grown up with weeds and brambles, and altogether bearing evidence of neglect and want of culture. I went into the barn, which I found without floor or doors, with the weather boarding off, and was altogether in keeping with the farm. While I viewed the desolation around me and was contemplating how it might be recovered from the curse upon it. End of quote. The narrative of the prophetic dream reveals that Joseph would return to the cursed church in the third watch and be rejected by it. They have cast away the law of the Lord. The lamentation in Isaiah 5 observes that the scattered and apostate saints of the latter day are so deluded and confused that they will call good evil and evil good. It will reveal why all of this came upon the house of Israel. Quote, because they have cast away the law of the Lord of hosts and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. Therefore is the anger of the Lord kindled against his people, and he hath stretched forth his hand against them. End of quote. Thankfully, the parable has a happy ending. The Lord does not give up on all of his people that had cast away the law of the Lord. His arm was stretched out still, his people who had cast away the law of the Lord. A small remnant of them will be gathered when the Lord lifts up an ensign. Quote, for all of his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. And he will lift up an ensign to the nations from afar, and will hasten to them from the end of the earth. And behold, they shall come with speed swiftly. End of quote. Getting back to the narrative of the history of the church, interestingly, Joseph's anxiety and plotting for the reclaiming of Jackson County dissipated following the week of the dedicatory prayer of the Kirtland Temple, the solemn assembly on Wednesday, and the subsequent secret visitation of Christ and 3 ministering angels on Sunday, April 3rd of 1836. From that time forward, he no longer plots to overtake Zion by September 11th. What few people realize is that the day and evening before the solemn assembly in Kirtland Temple, the entire First Presidency of the Church waited upon the Lord behind the veil, petitioning the Lord to allow the saints to once again make an attempt at redeeming Zion per the prophecy of the redemption of Zion in section 101 and 103. According to Joseph Smith, he and his 4 brethren of the First Presidency met in the most holy place within the Lord's house and sought, quote, a revelation from him to teach us concerning our going to Zion, end of quote. The following account can be viewed at the Joseph Smith Papers website. Quote, Mr. Presidents met in the Lord's house, tarried all night. At 11 o'clock a.m., Presidents Joseph Smith Jr., Frederick G. Williams, Sidney Rigdon, Hiram Smith, and Oliver Cowdery met in the most holy place in the Lord's house and sought for a revelation from him to teach us concerning our going to Zion and other important matters. After uniting in prayer, the voice of the Spirit was that we should come into this place 3 times and also call the other presidents, the 2 bishops and their councils, each to stand in his place and fast through the day and also the night, and that during this, if we would humble ourselves, we should receive further communication from him. End of quote. Although no definitive revelation regarding the retaking of Jackson County is recorded, shortly after that petition, Joseph told the elders, quote, that the time that we were required to tarry in Kirtland to be imbued would be fulfilled in a few days, and then the elders would go forth. End of quote. It must be remembered that the prophetic narrative in Scripture requires Zion to be established before the elders can go forth in power, gathering the elect to Zion. September 11th of 1836 came and went without Zion being redeemed. However, the date of September 11th would become a significant date for ominous things to happen during the years to come, including the Mountain Meadows Massacre on September 11th of 1857 and the downing of the Twin Towers on September 11th of 2001. In this chapter, we shall review a brief chronology of events leading up to and following the ominous date of September 11th of 1836, documenting that the stronghold of protection was removed from Kirtland after September 11th of 1836. We shall evaluate a non-exhaustive listing of historical events bullet points that will show that Pentecostal outpourings in the Kirtland Temple began in January of 1836, continuing through April 3rd of 1836, when Christ and three ministering angels secretly visited Joseph and Oliver behind the veil in the Kirtland Temple. Following the secret visitation behind the veil, Pentecostal outpourings continued for a season. A larger timeline snapshot of Pentecostal events shows that there was actually a 15-week period extending from January 21st until May 1st of 1836, during which visions and other types of otherworldly phenomena took place in relatively rapid succession during the meetings held in the Kirtland Temple. Following that season of spiritual endowments, there were random outpourings and random miraculous healings that were reported that seemed to continue sporadically for an extended period of time but then tapered off. Sadly, during the months leading up to the September 11th, 1836, and particularly following it, there began to be troubling signs within the church that all was not well. Among them, Joseph began to receive questionable revelations and to exercise poor judgment. He and other leaders of the church began to become obsessed with temporal matters and the acquisition of wealth. An attempt was made to replace him as the president of the church with David Whitmer. In fairness, it needs to be pointed out that Joseph and the other leaders of the church were under a huge amount of pressure because of the remaining debt that had been incurred from the construction of the Kirtland Temple. Nevertheless, some of Joseph's contemporaries contend that the leading brethren were overcome by greed. The testimony of Ebenezer Robinson. The following excerpt from the autobiography of Ebenezer Robinson provides an interesting snapshot into the events leading to the September 11th deadline, which includes some extravagant land speculation and the temptation to seek after a hidden treasure. Quote, "Immediately upon our return home from the mission spoken of in our last article, we discovered a great change had taken place in the church, especially with many of its leading official members. A spirit of speculation was poured out, and instead of that meek and lowly spirit which we had felt heretofore that had prevailed, a spirit of worldly ambition and grasping after the things of the world took its place. Some farms adjacent to Kirtland were purchased by some of the heads of the church, mostly on credit, and laid out into city lots, until a large city was laid out on paper, and the price of the lots put up to an unreasonable amount, ranging from $100 to $200 each, according to location. We were sorry to see this order of things, as we felt it would tend to evil instead of good. But having received an assurance of the truth of the gospel, and having an anxiety to warn our fellow men to flee from the wrath to come, and make their calling and election sure through obedience to the gospel, we therefore made arrangements to take a second mission. When at home, we worked in the printing office as usual. The hands in the office were the same as formerly, to wit, James Carrell, foreman, Don Carlos Smith, Joseph Smith's youngest brother, who was president of the Quorum of the High Priests, Solomon Wilbur Denton, who was a member of the High Priest's Quorum, and Samuel Brannan, who has since figured so extensively in San Francisco, California. We may have occasion to make mention of each of these hereafter. A brother in the church by the name of Burgess had come to Kirtland and stated that a large amount of money had been secreted in the cellar of a certain house in Salem, Massachusetts, which had belonged to a widow, and he thought he was the only person now living who had knowledge of it, or to the location of the house. We saw the brother Burgess, but Don Carlos Smith told us with regard to the hidden treasure. His statement was credited by the brethren, and steps were taken to try and secure the treasure, of which we will speak more fully in another place." End of quote. The treasure-seeking journey to Salem was a failure with regard to acquiring the desired treasure, and that the Lord referred to the trip as folly. In August of 1836, Brother Robinson had an open vision which is described in his diary. Quote, "I saw a beautiful female, perfect in form and features, who seemed a little taller than the average female, standing erect upon a platform elevated some 8 or 10 inches above the floor. But notwithstanding her beauty and perfect symmetry and form, she was full of sores from the crown of her head to the soles of her feet. I marveled into brackets and wondered within myself, is it possible the church is so corrupted?" Robinson would associate the above vision and his interpretation of it that the church was becoming corrupt, as evidenced by Joseph's uninspired treasure hunt in Salem, Massachusetts. Robinson continues, quote, "We soon learned that 4 of the leading men of the church had been to Salem, Massachusetts, in search of the hidden treasure spoken of by Brother Burgess, viz. Joseph Smith, Jr., Hiram Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and Oliver Cowdery. They left home on the 25th of July and returned in September. They were at Salem when we had that vision of the woman full of sores on the evening of the 12th of August at my brother Joseph's." End of quote. Robinson seemed to be associating Joseph's foolish treasure hunting expedition with the corruption of the church. Robinson and others of Joseph's contemporaries acknowledged that the spirit of meekness and humility among the leaders of the church was replaced by the spirit of greed and speculation. At about the same time, Joseph concocted the idea of establishing a public banking institution, which is the antithesis of the law of consecration. A banking institution would encourage and facilitate class distinction and the accumulation of individual wealth. It would also facilitate entering into commerce with unbelievers instead of preparing the hearts and minds of the saints for once again entering into a consecrated communal society where the saints would have all things in common, as practiced in the New Testament church in Acts chapter 2 and 4, and also as directed in the law of the gospel that the restored church had been given in section 42. Joseph promoted the banking venture as being inspired by the Holy Ghost. However, within 14 months after the September 11th deadline, the Kirtland Safety Society failed, resulting in a mass apostasy in Kirtland. Brother Robinson's autobiography provides the 14th article contained in the Articles of Agreement pertaining to the Kirtland Safety Society, followed by Joseph's declaration that the banking venture was inspired by the Holy Ghost. Quote, Article 14th, quote, "All notes given by said society shall be signed by the treasurer and secretary thereof, and we, the individual members of said firm, hereby hold ourselves bound for the redemption of all such notes." End of quote. At the conclusion of the Articles of Agreement, Joseph Smith Jr. proceeds to say, quote, "In connection with the above Articles of Agreement of the Kirtland Safety Society, I published the following remarks to all who were preparing themselves and appointing their wise men for the purpose of building up Zion and her stakes in the January number of the Messenger and Advocate." End of quote. Quote, "It is wisdom according to the mind of the Holy Spirit that you should call at Kirtland and receive counsel and instruction upon those principles that are necessary to further the great work of the Lord, and to establish the children of the kingdom, according to the oracles of God, as they are had among us. And further, we invite the brethren from abroad to call on us and to take stock in our safety society, and we would remind them also of the sayings of Isaiah contained in the 60th chapter, and more particularly the 9th and 17th verses, which are as follows. Surely the isles shall wait for me, and the ships of Tarshish first, to bring thy sons from afar their silver and their gold, not their banknotes, with them, unto the name of the Lord thy God, and to the Holy One of Israel, because he hath glorified thee. For brass I will bring gold, and for iron I will bring silver, and for wood brass, and for stones iron. I will also make thy officers peace, and thine exactors righteousness." End of quote. Also, so continuing on in the quote, also 62nd chapter, 1st verse, "For Zion's sake will I not hold my peace, and for Jerusalem's sake will I not rest, until the righteousness thereof go forth as brightness, and the salvation thereof as a lamp that burneth." End of quote. Joseph Smith Jr. Joseph Smith Jr. was elected treasurer, and Sidney Rigdon was elected secretary. In accordance with the foregoing arrangements, quite a large number of the bills were brought into the printing office, and the word anti, in very fine type, was printed before the word bank, and the syllable ing, also in fine type, was printed after the word bank, thus making it read Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company, in which form the bills were signed by Joseph Smith Jr. Treasurer and Sidney Rigdon Secretary and put into circulation as bank bills. We wish our readers to bear in mind that these things have nothing to do with the gospel, but they seem to show us the weakness of poor human nature and how easily men can be led astray when they cease to listen to the counsel of God, but are left to follow the dictates of their own will and carnal desires. The fruit of such conduct is exceedingly bitter, and the results most disastrous, as we will see further on. Speaking of these embarrassing historical issues, Brother Robinson states, quote, "We speak of these things with regret, but inasmuch as they occurred, we feel it our duty to relate them, as also some of those things which transpired under our personal observation soon after. failing to secure the Salem, Massachusetts treasure, and no demand for city lots, with their debts pressing heavily upon them, it evidently seemed necessary that some ways and means should be devised to extricate themselves from their present embarrassments. To this end, a banking institution was organized, called the Kirtland Safety Society. End of quote. Clearly, Robinson and other contemporaries of Joseph Smith who were fulfilling missions for the church and who were not in the managerial elite began to see a transition taking place in Kirtland, resulting in a downward spiritual trajectory that would result in the saints having to flee from Kirtland just as the Zion saints had fled from Jackson County. Interestingly, the difference between the Jackson County expulsion and the Kirtland expulsion was that the saints were run out of Jackson by angry non-Mormons. Conversely, the saints were run out of Kirtland by ex-Mormons, many of whom had served in the leading quorums of the church. Robinson notes that with the exception of a few disciplinary courts and dissensions from people who deny the faith, there had been a universal oneness until the banking institution had been established, which would cause a number of leading men of the church to split from the church. Quote, heretofore, there had been some individual church trials, which would naturally occur among a people as numerous as the church had become, and some individuals had denied the faith. There had not been any general dissension, however, but a universal oneness seemed to prevail until after the banking institution had been established. During the winter and spring of 1837, a great split occurred between a number of the leading elders of the church. Frederick G. Williams, one of the first presidency, Martin Harris, David Whitmer, Lucan Lyman Johnson, Parley P. Pratt, William E. McClellan, John F. Boynton. The last five named were members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, Roger Orton, one of the 70, and a number of others, including S. Wilbur Denton, printer, a high priest, who testified of having seen a great vision during the time of the washings and anointings the preceding March. These all objected to the course being pursued by Brother Joseph Smith, Jr. and the church, but we asked no particulars with regard to the matter, thinking that all things would be reconciled in a short time, and church matters move along as heretofore. One thing we felt sure of, the gospel was true, and that truth and righteousness would ultimately prevail. The saints be gathered, Zion redeemed and established in everlasting strength, and we believed the church was the medium through which the glorious result would be brought about. Therefore looked upon all who opposed or who did not agree with Joseph Smith, Jr. and the church as weak in the faith, or dissenters from the faith. But the disaffection continued, and if anything, grew stronger. End of quote. The apostasy in Kirtland extended to Missouri. In Robinson's autobiography, he notes that the apostasy in Kirtland had been ignited by the banking fiasco, extended to far west. Quote, the division in the church extended to Missouri. Several of the brethren who were disaffected with Brother Joseph Smith, Jr. were living in far west, but we adhered to him, feeling that it was necessary to do so in order to retain a standing in the church, and knowing the gospel to be true, we prized a standing in the church as above price. Besides, we had a dream soon after reaching far west which helped settle the matter in our mind. We dreamed that we was a long piece of hewed timber, apparently about 14 inches square, elevated upon blocks the right height for the master workman to lay off of the framework, and Brother Joseph Smith, Jr. standing by it with a square and scratch awl in his hands, laying out the work. After receiving this dream, we felt confirmed in our desire to remain with and work for the church. Notwithstanding our better judgment taught us the city lot speculation and bank business was contrary to the spirit of the gospel. Darkness and confusion followed these transactions, as will be seen by the following proceedings of the High Council, which we copy from the History of Joseph Smith, Jr., as published in the Millennial Star, Volume 16, page 10, as follows. Bracket. Ebenezer Robinson cites the minutes of a High Council meeting in Kirtland, May 29, 1837, in which David Whitmer, Frederick G. Williams, Lyman Johnson, Parley P. Pratt, and Warren Parrish were charged with a complaint against their conduct. The meeting was dispersed in confusion when the presiding officers determined that they could not try the case. Into bracket. These proceedings were had in a little over a month after we left Kirtland. We present these things to show that the course pursued by Joseph Smith, Jr. and some of the heads of the church was contrary to the clear and express command of the Lord, and that David Whitmer and others had good reason for entering their protest and withholding their influence from such an order of things. The foregoing action of the High Council at Kirtland clearly shows that they were devoid of the Spirit of the Lord. Consequently, any act of theirs while in that condition could not affect the spiritual standing of any person whom they might profess to deal with. The High Council at Far West seemed to be in a similar condition, judging from the following proceedings had by them. We quote from the history of Joseph Smith Jr. as published in the 16th volume of the Millennial Star, commencing on the 115th page. Quote, Ebenezer Robinson here cites minutes in the proceedings of the Committee of the Whole Church in Zion, February the 5th, 1838, moderated by Thomas B. Marsh, then president of the Quorum of the 12 and president of the High Council in Missouri. The council brought charges against the presidency of the church in Missouri, David Whitmer, John Whitmer, and William W. Phelps. In particular, John Whitmer and Phelps were charged with selling their lands in Jackson County. A vote was called for, the majority disfavoring the presidency, and a minority, 8 or 10, only wished them to continue in office a little longer, or until Joseph Smith Jr. came up. On March the 10th of 1838, William W. Phelps and John Whitmer were excommunicated by the council and congregation. Marcellus Cowdery then arose to claim that the tribunal was illegal and read a letter addressed to Thomas B. Marsh by the Whitmers and Phelps, in which they too asserted the High Council and the church, or the members, assembled, formed an illegal tribunal with no jurisdiction over the presidency. Because Marcellus Cowdery read this letter in public before delivering it to the addressee, Marsh, which was considered an insult, he was disfellowshipped. That's in History of the Church, Volume 3. When Joseph Smith fled Kirtland and relocated to Far West, Missouri, one of his first official acts of business was to replace David Whitmer, John Whitmer, and William W. Phelps as the first presidency of the church in Zion, with Thomas B. Marsh, David W. Patton, and Brigham Young. The move was astonishing in multiple ways. For one thing, David Whitmer and his counselors, who had served in the presidency of the church in Jackson County, had just recently been sustained in those same callings by the saints in Far West. Apparently, the reason for replacing these brethren had to do with random worthiness issues, including the nonconformity to the word of wisdom, but the proper scriptural protocol for church discipline was not used. Additionally, all three members in the new presidency were of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. This quorum had been told both in Scripture and by Joseph Smith that as lifelong members of the traveling High Council, they were not allowed to preside in an organized stake of Zion. Of course, it's debatable as to whether an established stake of Zion could exist now that the center stake in Jackson County and the stronghold stake in Kirtland, which had cryptically been referred to as Jerusalem, had failed and been abandoned. This and other developments ultimately resulted in David Whitmer and the Whitmer family, Oliver Cowdery, and other leading brethren of the church to leave the church. The use of the members of the Quorum of the 12 in presiding over the church in the land of Zion actually may have had deeper cryptic implications, having to do with the reestablishment of an ancient tribal kingdom, as will be discussed in this chapter and another one. In hindsight, it almost seems inconceivable that more people did not question what was going on when Joseph Smith began doing bizarre things like going on treasure hunts that God declared to be folly, establishing banking ventures that completely contradicted the law of the gospel economics that had been given to the church, and releasing existing presidencies without following protocol, while replacing them with apostles that were not commissioned to preside in the stakes of Zion. One thing to keep in mind, however, is that the prophet worship that modern Latter-day Saints currently engage in was actually alive and well during those early years of the Restoration movement. Notice the following observations and admissions made by Robinson. Quote, on the 14th of March, 1838, Joseph Smith Jr. arrived at Far West and his family, and on the 4th of April, Sidney Rigdon also arrived with his family. Joseph Smith Jr. was held in very high esteem by the masses of the people, members of the church, and looked upon as being invested with powers and qualifications far above all other men, being, as they thought, a great prophet of God, like unto Moses, and that, like Elisha, he could tell their actions and almost their thoughts when absent from them. They rejoiced to think they were permitted to live to see the day when prophets and apostles were restored to the earth again. Therefore, there was great rejoicing when he arrived among them. End of quote. A demeaning and mean-spirited servant of God. Although the questionable revelations and poor judgment by Joseph Smith previously mentioned provide red flags for those attempting to make sense out of the crazy times and cognitive dissonance that followed the historical tipping point brought about by the failure to redeem Zion by September 11th, another strange phenomena began to emerge following the removal of the stronghold. It has to do with the meanness and demoralizing way of how Joseph Smith began treating other leaders and members of the church that disagreed with him or crossed him in any way. During the Far West era, when the Whitmer family withdrew from the church, Joseph and Sidney asked John Whitmer, the official church historian, to hand over the official history of the church that he had been keeping. Whitmer had been called by revelation to be the church historian. When John Whitmer refused to hand over the official history of the church, this is the letter that Joseph sent to him, which was later published in the Millennial Star. Quote, Mr. John Whitmer, sir, we were desirous of honoring you by giving publicly to your notes on the history of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, after making such corrections as we thought would be necessary, knowing your incompetency as a historian, that writings coming from your pen could not be put to press without correcting them, or else the church must suffer reproach. Indeed, sir, we never supposed you capable of writing a history, but were willing to let it come out under your name, notwithstanding it would really not be yours, but ours. We are still willing to honor you, if you can be made to know your own interest, and give up your notes, so that they can be corrected and made fit for the press. But if not, we have all the materials for another, which we shall commence this week to write. End of quote. Your obedient servants, Joseph Smith, Jr., Presidents of the whole Church of Latter-day Saints. Attested by Ebenezer Robinson Clerk. Publicly declaring that John Whitmer was an incompetent historian and claiming that his efforts in keeping a history of the church would cause the church to suffer reproach seems a bit harsh, particularly since Whitmer had been called to that calling by the Lord. Although Joseph had had previous conflicts with personalities, it's my contention that Joseph Smith's propensity for treating people this way increased after the fullness of the gospel was rejected in December of 1834, and then accelerated after the September 11th deadline came and went. Another case in point that took place during the dark period in church history has to do with a conflict that Joseph had with Sidney Rigdon. The accounts contained in the journal of John D. Lee. John was essentially the adopted son of Brigham Young, who ended up becoming the scapegoat for the Mountain Meadows Massacre. He provides a heartbreaking account of an incident that happened between Joseph and Sidney Rigdon that appears to mark a pivotal point in the ministry of Sidney Rigdon. Quote, during the time that we were camping at Adamond-Diamond, waiting to see what would be the result of the quarrel between our church and the Gentiles, one Sunday morning, it had rained heavily the night before, and the air was cold. The men were shivering over a few firebrands, feeling out of sorts and quite cast down. The prophet came up while the brethren were moping around and caught first one and then another and shook them up and said, get out of here and wrestle, jump, run, do anything but mope around. Warm yourselves up. This inactivity will not do for soldiers. Those words of the prophet put life and energy into the men. A ring was soon formed, according to the custom of the people. The prophet stepped into the ring, ready for a tussle with any corner. Several went into the ring to try their strength, but each one was thrown by the prophet until he had thrown several of the stoutest of the men present. Then he stepped out of the ring and took a man by the arm and led him to take his place, and so it continued, the men who were thrown retiring in favor of the successful one. A man would keep the ring so long as he threw his adversary. The style of wrestling varied with the desires of the parties. The Eastern men, or Yankees, used square hold, or collar and elbow. Those with the middle states, side hold, and the Southern and Western men used breeches hold and an old Indian hug, or back hold. If a man was hurt, he stood it without a murmur. It was considered cowardly and childish to whine when thrown down or hurt in the fall. While the sport was at its height, Sidney Rigdon, the mouthpiece of the prophet, rushed into the ring, sword in hand, and said that he would not suffer a lot of men to break the Sabbath day in that manner. For a moment all were silent. Then one of the brethren, with more presence of mind than the others, said to the prophet, Brother Joseph, we want you to clear us from blame, for we formed the ring by your request. You told us to wrestle, and now Brother Rigdon is bringing us to account for it. The prophet walked into the ring and said, as he made a motion with his hand, Brother Sidney, you had better go out of here and let the boys alone. They're amusing themselves according to my orders. You are an old man. You go and get ready for meeting and let the boys alone. Just then, catching Rigdon off his guard, as quick as a flash, he knocked the sword from Rigdon's hand, then caught him by the shoulder and said, Now, old man, you must go out, or I will throw you down. Rigdon was as large a man as the prophet, but not as tall. The prospect of a tussle between the prophet and the mouthpiece of the prophet was fun for all but Rigdon, who pulled back like a crawfish. But the resistance was useless. The prophet dragged him from the ring, bareheaded, and tore Rigdon's fine pulpit coat from the collar to the waist. Then he turned to the men and said, "Go in, boys, and have your fun. You shall never have it to say that I got you into any trouble that I did not get you out of." Rigdon complained about the bout of his hat and the tearing of his coat. The prophet said to him, "You were out of your place. Always keep your place and you will not suffer. But you got a little out of your place and you have to suffer for it. You have no one to blame but yourself." End of quote. Imagine how humiliated and demoralized Brother Sidney must have felt to be ridiculed in that manner by another one of the Lord's anointed. The disrespect and cruelty he showed to Brother Sidney, the Lord's spokesman, that day, and the disregard for keeping the Sabbath day holy was one of the many defining moments in a pivotal transition that Joseph and the church were experiencing during the Far West era, following the September 11th deadline to redeem Zion. Rigdon would later declare during the Nauvoo era that he had been silent for nearly 5 years and that the Spirit of the Lord had not been present in the church for a long time. Interestingly, the 5 years of silence appears to have begun relatively close to the unfortunate event mentioned above. Clearly, the withdrawing of the Spirit of the Lord began to accelerate following the removal of the stronghold in Kirtland in September of 1836. A pattern emerges. In this chapter, a brief listing of historical events will be provided showing a clear pattern of how the stronghold in Kirtland was being removed as events such as Parley Pratt's revelation that the gospel would be taken from the Gentiles, Joseph Smith's affair with Fanny Alger, the uninspired treasure hunt in Salem, the false revelation to establish the Kirtland Safety Society, and other events not congruent with the fullness of the gospel began taking the church into a downward spiral trajectory. Keep in mind that the leading up to the dedicatory prayer in the solemn assembly that took place in March of 1836, Joseph had promised that those that were pure in heart would see God, and that an endowment would be enjoyed that would enable the elders to go forth in power for the last time, sealing up the righteous and the wicked, and gathering the elect to Zion. Keep also in mind the fact that the saints were struggling as they approached the temple ceremonies in March and April of 1836. According to statements made by Wilford Woodruff in his diary in February of 1836 and again on April 28th of 36, the spirit of murmuring, complaining, and mutiny was being manifest among the saints. He noticed that some of the leaders in high positions of responsibility were beginning to reject the leadership of Joseph Smith and were, quote, striving to overthrow his influence, end of quote. When addressing the quorum of the 12 apostles and attempting to prepare them for the upcoming endowment of the Kirtland Temple, Joseph had exclaimed that their minds were so dark that Gabriel himself could not explain it to them. Among those that believed and supported the leadership of Joseph Smith, it was because of the expected endowment and final taking of the gospel to the world in power for the last time that many of the saints were perplexed when no missionary endeavor of such magnitude took place after the week of the solemn assembly and related endowments took place. Interestingly, during or directly after the ceremonial events of the Kirtland Temple, Joseph Smith warned of an impending apostasy. Quote, "At or near the close of the endowments, the prophet Joseph addressed us. Among other things he said, 'Brethren, for some time Satan has not had power to tempt you. Some have thought that there would be no more temptation, but the opposite will come, and unless you draw near to the Lord, you will be overcome and apostatize.' A few months later, 4 of the apostles were cut off from the church for apostasy, and the standing of 1 or 2 others was very doubtful. Numbers from other quorums also fell away and were cut off." End of quote. For over a year after those events in the Kirtland Temple, there was no major missionary effort such as the one anticipated. Finally, 14 months after the anticipated missionary effort on June the 4th of 1837, just prior to the mass apostasy that would be created by the Kirtland safety fiasco, Joseph Smith would announce to the bewildered saints who were trying to make sense of things that, quote, "God revealed to me that something new must be done for the salvation of his church," end of quote. That declaration was followed by the establishment of foreign missions by members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, despite the fact that the quorum had been in an ongoing state of disunity and chaos ever since the Lord had pronounced the Quorum of the 12 to be under condemnation in November of 1835. Quote, "Thus came the word of the Lord unto me concerning the 12, saying, Behold, they are under condemnation because they have not sufficiently been humble in my sight, and in consequence of their covetous desires, and that they have not dealt equally with each other in division of moneys which come into their hands." End of quote. The Quorum of the 12 continued to struggle as recorded in section 112 of the D&C, previously addressed in this chapter. It's a shocking dichotomy that the anticipated plan of sending the sanctified elders, or high priests, having Melchizedek priesthood authority to gather the elect for the last time, was replaced with a plan of sending an apostate quorum of apostles who were not yet converted. Joseph's new plan was fulfilling the prophecy of Jesus Christ in 3 Nephi 16. Now that the Gentiles had rejected the fullness of the gospel, the knowledge of the gospel was to be taken to the house of Israel. New converts from the house of Israel would begin pouring into Nauvoo within a matter of years. Listing of significant historical events relating to the September 11, 1836 deadline. At or near the close of the endowments in 1836, Joseph warns the saints that, quote, Satan has not had power to tempt you. Some have thought that there would be no more temptation, but the opposite will come, and unless you draw near to the Lord, you will be overcome and apostatize. End of quote. July 25, 1836, Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and Oliver Cowdery leave for Salem, Massachusetts, to seek for hidden treasure. The trip was uninspired with regard to the treasure hunt, and the Lord referred to it as folly. They arrive in Salem on August 6th and return to Kirtland in September of 1836. Then, in July of 1836, Parley P. Pratt receives a revelation of the Lord commanding him to, quote, go unto this people, the Gentiles, and cry unto them with a mighty voice that they repent, lest I smite them with a curse. For notwithstanding the present fruitfulness of the earth, there shall be a famine in the land, and not a famine for bread only, but a famine for the word of the Lord. For I will call my servants out from their midst, and send them to the nations afar off. End of quote. This was a bone-chilling congruent with Christ's prophecy in 3 Nephi 16. Now that the Gentiles had rejected the fullness of the gospel, the knowledge of the fullness, the Book of Mormon, would not be published among the house of Israel, while the Gentile church in America would languish in a doctrinal famine. Virtually every pure doctrine taught during the Restoration would eventually be altered or discarded. September 11th of 1836, nothing of significance happened on that day, which in fact is significant because it was the appointed time for the redemption of Zion. Joseph had revealed in a letter written in August of 34 that September 11th, 1836, was the appointed time for the redemption of Zion. His declaration came from the 5-year prophecy contained in section 64 that Kirtland would no longer be a stronghold for the saints after September 11th of 1836. January 2nd of 1837 was the Kirtland Safety Society organized. February 19th of 37, at a priesthood meeting held in the upper room of the Kirtland Temple, several of the leaders of the church, including members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, witnesses of the Book of Mormon, and other leaders recommended that Joseph Smith be replaced by David Whitmer as the president of the church. Others opposed. The meeting ended without agreement on a course of action. April 6th and 7th of 1837. One April 6th, a solemn assembly was held in commemorating the organization of the church. It's claimed that Pentecostal gifts occurred at that time. Another meeting was held the next day in which some of the saints claimed to experience a Pentecostal outpouring. June the 4th of 1837. This is in History of the Church, Volume 2. Although Joseph had told the elders that the great last missionary work would begin directly after the Kirtland Temple endowments in March and April of 1836, nothing of significance took place for over a year until finally Joseph Smith announced that, quote, God revealed to me that something new must be done for the salvation of the church, end of quote. Quote, the Spirit of the Lord has whispered to me, let my servant Heber go to England and proclaim my gospel and open the door of salvation to that nation. This, end of quote. This is consistent with the prophecy of Christ in the Book of Mormon, that the gospel would be taken to the house of Israel after the Gentiles reject the fullness. See 3 Nephi 16, 10 through 13. June 11th of 1837, the Far West High Council voted that the temple building committee be upheld in the mercantile business, and that the right of no man be infringed upon to do as he chose according to the law of God or man. This proceeding, which allows for the funding of the temple in Zion to be accomplished from a mercantile business, is in conflict with the commandment of God for the funding to be provided by the law of consecration, which had been discontinued. Furthermore, the vote was releasing everyone from the obligation of living the law of God as had been given in section 42. July the 23rd of 1837, section 112, the Lord declares that darkness covers the whole earth, and gross darkness the minds of the people, and all flesh has become corrupt before my face. End of quote. The fall of 1837, Joseph's accused of having a dirty, nasty affair with Fanny Alger by Oliver Cowdery. Historians differ in their speculations about whether it was a celestial wife sealing or an indiscretion. There are also disagreements on when it actually took place. Some speculate that it took place as early as 1831 or 1833, but most credible historians seem to agree that it was in 1835 or 36, probably in the fall of 36. The historical context and narrative provided in chapter 24 of this book settles the dispute. It appears to have taken place after the fullness of the gospel was rejected, and the Spirit of the Lord began to withdraw from the saints. Chapters 3 through 5 provide the storyline behind the storyline that Joseph was taking upon himself the sins of apostate Latter-day Israel. November of 1837, failure of the Kirtland Safety Society. Also in November of 1837, mass apostasy of leaders and members of the church. And also in November of 1837, defiling of the Kirtland Temple. The failure of the Kirtland Safety Society resulted in a mass apostasy of many members and leaders of the church. Related to this event and time of apostasy was a fight that broke out in the temple with leading members of the church threatening to kill each other. If the temple had not been defiled before this event, it surely was defiled at the time the fight broke out. The fight was documented by Eliza Snow and Lucy Smith. November 7th of 1837, in a fit of anger and without any formal church hearing or official protocol or a revelation from the Lord, Joseph Smith drops Frederick G. Williams from the first presidency. December 10th of 1837, the prophet Joseph Smith returns from far west. The apostates are openly denouncing Joseph and trying to replace him with David Whitmer as the president of the church. And that's in Volume 2 of History of the Church. January 12th of 1838, Joseph and Sidney flee Kirtland. March of 1838, section 113, Joseph explains that Isaiah 11 prophesies that at a future time, when he will bring again Zion, those who had been called in the last days would, quote, put on the authority of the priesthood, which she, Zion, had a right to by lineage, also to return to that power which she had lost. End of quote. Quote, these scattered remnants are exhorted to return to the Lord from whence they have fallen. If they do, he will speak to them again or give them revelation. End of quote. April 6th of 1838, David Whitmer and the others of the First Presidency of Zion are released by Joseph Smith and replaced by the members of the Quorum of the 12. April 12th and 13th of 1838, the church trials of Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, and Lyman Johnson. April 26th of 1838, section 115, although the saints had previously begun calling themselves the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, this section is used as the official justification for the name change. June of 1838, the establishment of the Danites to be the avenging sword of the Lord. And then between November of 1837 and June of 1838, approximately 300 saints withdrew from the church, and about a third of the leaders of the church were excommunicated, disfellowshipped, or removed from the church callings. Many eventually returned to the church. July 6th of 1838, the main body of believers in Kirtland flee from Ohio. Over 500 saints leave their homes, businesses, land, and temple in Kirtland to begin a 3-month journey to northern Missouri. July 8th of 1838, section 117, Oliver Granger is to pray for the redemption of the First Presidency. August 6th of 1838, the beginning of the Missouri Mormon War, which began at the Gallatin election battle and ended on November 1st of 1838, when Joseph Smith surrendered at Far West. Approximately 22 people were killed during skirmishes at Crooked River and Haun's Mill. This war resulted in nearly all Mormons being forced to leave the state. I believe the above listing clearly shows a pattern of how the stronghold in Kirtland was removed, as promised in the 5-year prophecy contained in section 64. 2 kinds of false prophets: institutional versus non-institutional.